Well, now I'm going to ask some of my colleagues from my old AMR days to come up and let's talk about the supply chains we admire. So we have Roddy Martin and CJ Wehlage and Mickey North Rizza, and we're going to share kind of our collective insights about the industries and about performance and improvement and what we see in the data. So come on up, and you know, it's great to be back on stage with you guys. It's seems like yesterday, but it's been a long time, hasn't it? Yeah? So let me just sit here. Yeah. So let's talk about the data. So CJ, tell the group a little bit about yourself, because I kind of think about you as a high-tech kind of guy.
Certainly would call that. I spent 2 years at AMR Research. My background, I'm at Kinaxis now for 2 years, but my background's in high-tech. Late 80s, Apple Computer, Singapore, went over to EMC. Happy to see they're on your most admired list. Bose, the speaker company, and then what took me to San Diego is VP of Supply Chain at Sony Electronics.
Yeah, a lot of learning there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and Mickey, a lot of time in sourcing. Tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So my background as a practitioner, Tyco, I've done a lot of work with Motorola, a couple startups in there, and then I went to Moduslink, and then I came over to AMR, worked with Lora on the sourcing and procurement side of the equation, and the rest of the team in supply chain, and now I'm with BravoSolution covering the sourcing space.
And Roddy, how about yourself? Tell the group a little bit about
Yeah,
yourself.
so I started life at what in those days was South African Breweries, today is SAB Miller, whereas where I got into manufacturing and supply chain, came over to the States, was with AMR Research for 10 years, and joined Accenture in the strategy practice about 2 years ago. And focus really on consumer goods and life sciences, but do spend a lot of time in the industrial sector as well.
So the design of this panel is we've got very different points of view by industry. Roddy, very strong in healthcare and life sciences and consumer goods. Mickey with retail and sourcing, and CJ with high tech. We're going to look at the results for performance and improvement. First of all, guys, what do you think of the methodology? Who wants to go first?
I'm going to jump in here because I'm really excited about the methodology, and there are a couple of reasons why I think it's really breakthrough thinking. And each time I sort of look at industry results and look at the orbit charts, they tell a story. So first of all, there's a time and a context domain to the methodology, which I think a lot of the other approaches to benchmarking and best practices don't address. You made the point, and I think it's absolutely true, that the reason why a lot of companies don't see continuous improvement translate into business results is because they're focusing on vertical silos and projects. What this does is it looks at the context of operating margin and inventory terms. And I think there's even further domains that you could explore. So, for example, imagine if you looked at the rate of margin improvement or the rate of margin loss, because that even tells you a lot about how a company is approaching the challenge.
So the rate is actually in the strength. That's part of the calculation. Mickey, how about yourself? What do you think of the methodology?
I like the resiliency aspect. I love the fact that it's looking at the operating margin and inventory. I like the fact that it's looking at growth and the revenue and how everything comes together. I think there's some important points out of it, though, that may get buried in it, and I think that Dave actually brought up a good point around that, and that is that you're going to have changes as you go through your business, and part of that change that you bring up may impact how you actually view in these various aspects. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It means that you need to make a change for the business. And the question I asked him afterwards, while we were getting mic'd up here, was, you know, if you looked at your M&A activity, you said it had some sort of effect on you. M&A activity is something you can step and repeat if you build the right business practice around it, but depending on what you're buying and the way you bring it into the organization, it's going to have an impact one way or the other on the resiliency.
Absolutely.
So they're all good points. So you're capturing these. It's just how they all come together.
But it's about conscious choice, and
Absolutely.
so much it's not conscious.
Yeah.
CJ, how about your thoughts?
Definitely. For high tech, if you scan the landscape, we have years of knowledge of people that have been in planning. They've been doing this as an industry. So there's some very sharp, solid people in supply chain. The thing that we did to ourselves, over the last 20 years is we've outsourced a ton of the supply chain. Cisco, 85% of their network is outsourced. So we've been forced to look at end-to-end. The thing I like about the index is we spent years in high tech putting in functional solutions. Now we have to look at this end-to-end because it is an external network. It requires us to collaborate with our suppliers, first, second, and third tier.
And we're not very good at that. So here's the supply chains to admire. Right, so on one side, we've got those in the consumer value network. We've got 15 companies that make the list. Colgate at the top for consumer packaged goods, Ralph Lauren and Nike for apparel, Eastman and BASF for chemical, General Mills for food and beverage, along with InBev. And then we've got on the industrial side, TSMC, Intel, EMC, Apple, Cisco Systems, which is in the room, Seagate, TRW, and Aldi. Okay, now, Roddy, the first thing is no one's there from pharma or medical device. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me because not to sound trite about this, but the life sciences industry is living with the hangover of high margins. And so therefore, there has been no reason up until now to really manage inventory and inventory terms. I mean, it's 200 days, 300 days worth of inventory is the way they deal with, the agility of their supply chain. So no, it doesn't surprise me, but I will tell you that virtually all of the life sciences, especially pharma companies that I'm working with, have a demand-driven strategy on the cards, right? So the vision is we want to move to patient-driven. I'm not so sure that they understand what that really means.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do they understand it? And okay, now CJ, you saw the resiliency, right? So these companies on this industrial value network, right? High demand, high supply volatility, right? But yet they pull up to the top of the stack. Why do you think that's so?
Yeah, I'll pick on Apple here because this inventory turns and operating margin are a game they play. As product goes through its life cycle. So they're not necessarily concerned about resiliency. And I tell you right now, iPhone 6, there's probably tons of inventory of iPhone 6 right now in lieu of revenue. They leverage cash to cover that. It's not a concern that inventory turn might be low. On the flip side, you can get an iPhone 5 now for the same price. They maintain the margin, but then they'll give you a $300 iTunes card for free. So they're leveraging the product, leveraging the cash flow to manage that life cycle of that product. So, when you think about 9 months, they're switching out products. Resiliency doesn't come to the top of the list by design.
But, when I work with these companies, they're better at networks, management of those tiers of suppliers. They're further along. They're also, I think, better at design. We've got a presentation later from Intel about the work that they're doing on design. It's a real different mindset. Seagate, how they're doing design. Cisco, how they're looking at risk. I mean, how is that mindset different?
Yeah, I think it starts with the network is outsourced by nature. It's a lot of different nodes that are external to what you have. It's not in your systems. So couple that with, like Intel is going to do a presentation, they put in a great leadership program for the supply chain masters. That allows people to really take a look at that network. How is it best optimized? EMC is a great example. Worked there for 8 years. They very much design their product around engineering change orders, new product introductions. So if you imagine a new product from EMC coming out, they can't just go out and change all the customers' data centers. So they've really crafted and designed their supply chain network around the engineering atmosphere. So they're very in tune with, collaborating with suppliers and collaborating with engineering.
Now, Mickey, when you look at this and you think about all the companies you've worked with, what speaks to you?
A couple things. First off, when I look at the high-tech area, I think there's a lot of learning for the rest of the value networks that come out of that. Not only do you have that network optimization, you're bringing value across the entire platform, so to speak, of all the different third parties that you're bringing together within that value network. As you start looking at that and you look at some of these other ones, like you don't see a lot on the retail area, you don't see the Sainsbury's, you don't see the Tesco's, you don't see a lot of folks in there. You see a Ralph Lauren and Nike, that gets apparel and the footwear, that's a different aspect. But when you start looking at some of the others, you're saying to yourself, why aren't they there? And it's because they're spending more time on just operating margin or inventory? Are they not looking across from an end-to-end perspective? Are they looking, I work for a sourcing and solution company. We look at that side of the equation, but are they only looking at that? Right. They're not looking at the planning stages. They're not looking at the customer side. They're not pulling it all together. So what stands out to me is it's a very small list of some very big companies, but there's a lot more out there. And the question I have back for those companies that are not on this list, What are you doing and what changes are you making to start looking at these trends and trying to get to that next level?
And we actually have Colgate, and we have General Mills, and we have InBev in the room, and we have Intel and Cisco in the room, and I think it's great for you to share stories. Roddy, anything that speaks to you additionally?
Yeah, you know what I can't help not seeing, and that is this, in the consumer value side, Colgate, General Mills, BASF, AB InBev did a really superb job of putting in their enterprise systems. Governance-driven, highly structured. I think that they're, to an extent, are backtracking a little to get some flexibility back into the organization. But it's kind of interesting that there's that strong governance foundation to the way they put their systems in place in the business.
And the other thing is, I think they maintained that core IT capability versus outsourcing IT and, some of that. They got really good at it. It's interesting for me to contrast General Mills and Kellogg's results, right? And, Kellogg tried to do the ERP system 3 times and badly, and General Mills did it, one of the best in the industry. So let's just look at high-level insights, right? No one from retail, paper packaging, pharmaceutical, medical device makes the list, right?
Cost-driven. I will never forget sitting in front of a head of supply chain for a big packaging company, and he said, we buy wood and then we make paper. And I said, well, why don't you first read the demand and then buy the wood? And he said, why didn't I think of that? Right? So, and by the time they've bought all this wood because they got it at a decent price, all this timber, half the stuff is lost, and so the wastage is huge, and the inefficiencies are huge. So, that does not surprise me. Paper, it's difficult to make, 1-ton paper jumbo rolls on demand-driven basis unless you get your demand forecast right. So I think there's some unique challenges. But the point that I made about pharmaceutical and medical devices is I think we will see that. Remember, the acquisitions happening in that space are huge. I mean, you look at Pfizer and Wyeth. These are not buying products. These are buying whole companies with very different cultures. And they've got to get over that hangover of bringing all those mental models and cultures together to operate as one supply chain.
Well, what about the next point? I mean, P&G didn't make the list, Toyota, Samsung, Walmart. What do you think about that, CJ?
Yeah, the one that surprised me was Samsung. And I have some history with Samsung. I really admire their S&OP process. Know the folks there. I think to the gentleman that was asking about the conglomerates, I'm looking at your data on Samsung specifically because it perplexes me, and I was hoping they'd be higher. But when I look at what they do, TVs, cell phones, semiconductors, white goods like washer and dryer, they're getting into biotech, and digital content purchase they're going to be making. So there's a lot of different things going on. They mold those together to the conglomerate issues. So I think the numbers might be good if it could be broken down by each division.
Well, let's hope they call me to do that. Roddy, you're lots of years, beating the drum of P&G and, many of those companies you talk about a lot. Does this surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me. I'll tell you, each one of those companies, as CJ said, I absolutely admired Samsung's S&OP process. And you think about, drive a car off the lot and there's already Toyota are starting to manufacture the next one. P&G, the consumer. They clearly are recognized and remembered for contributions they made to supply chain. But too much of a good thing can also become a bad thing. And I think the challenges today are looking at the supply chain maybe from a different point of view. So I think many recognized industry leaders didn't make the list this time, but I think and I know for a fact that there are activities underway that may change in the future.
And the other thing is, if you look at somebody like Toyota, you've got to wonder what the impact of recalls have been on them.
Absolutely.
I mean, what has that done to an end value?
Yeah, and we've seen that in their numbers clearly. But I thought, the fact that the companies that have the biggest issue with demand and supply volatility, that they pulled up, whereas those that had kind of easier sailing weren't making improvement, was a great insight from this study. And the degree of it was what was surprising to me. Thoughts there?
Yeah, I also think, by the way, that leadership, and you make the point a number of times that a lot of this is leader-driven. I mean, you think about when P&G was absolutely executing par excellence in supply chain, led by Lafley, Keith Harrison driving supply chain. P&G was clicking away, and there's been a lot of leadership changes in the organization, and that has a huge impact on these organizations.
Yeah, like Dave's presentation earlier, I mean, that's a good example of leadership, right? You don't see that often. You ask questions about, how do I manage a function, but not necessarily end-to-end. So I think that's really great.
I'd add one more point, alignment. It isn't just alignment to the leader, it's alignment across the organization and amongst the different stakeholders, across the different functions, and bringing everything to the forefront of what you need to do. When you start looking at what you have to do because you've got an environment you have to compete in, you start making a difference and a change and a paradigm change basically in your organization to say, we've got to do better. You become more competitive. You start fighting for it. So it really is about that tough get going.
Well, in 12 of the 13 industries improved resiliency despite the volatility in the market, right? I think that is an attribute of what we've been doing. But 11 out of 13 lost ground at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. What are your thoughts there, CJ?
Yeah, so I think in consumer electronics, it's almost by design. Some forms, depending on when the new product date comes out, removing excess inventory. What do you do with the pricing of that excess inventory? So, in order for certain growth, you look at Apple, $150 billion in cash, doing something right as far as getting their margins. I noticed their margin was flat. It's because they're moving the excess inventory with digital product. But I get a sense of, I don't think resiliency is quite in the practice of consumer electronics right now because they're so 9-month short-term focused.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that because I think that there's a common acceptance that visibility in the supply chain is one of the weak points. I mean, it came up on one of your slides. Therefore, companies are going after visibility, and therefore resilience is going to improve. The problem is, and I loved your comment about crazy consultants in the report. Because
not that you identify with that.
No, not
right?
at all, not at all. But I think that the real risk of inventory and operating margins is you can go after those with a lot of fragmented projects. And the number of times I've heard from leadership teams that, yes, the teams tell us the projects are going really well, but why don't I see it in the business results? That's what you're seeing there, right? I mean, the inventory is optimization, or it's segmentation, or it's redesigning the network, or it's costs for operating margins. And I think that when we start connecting the dots, exactly why I asked Campbell's the question, how are you systematizing the connecting of the dots between all these initiatives? Because that's when you'll see the operating margins, inventory turns, intersection start improving.
And the other side I'd say to that is when you look back at something that Dr. Tyson spoke about when she said that we can forecast the direction of the change, but we can't forecast the timing or not the impact, I think the margin of what that change is going to be. You start looking at this, companies are going after one or the other, or pieces of it. They're not looking at it in a holistic standpoint. And then the other thing you have to bring up is supply chain may not be aligned to the rest of the organization. And where the C-level organization is going from, we have to really come back to our shareholders and what we're going to bring them.
Yeah, Roddy and I talked last night, there's a tool aspect to this, as much as I was in business aspect is right now, we have good experts at procurement and know how to place a purchase order, good experts at planning that could go into business intelligence tools and do planning. But what we're asking here is an end-to-end, outside your network, end-to-end operating margin or turn question. Somebody like TSMC does fabulous work. You'd never heard of them, but do fabulous work at understanding the cost and sustainability across their network. They desire to know that. They put in tools in place. I don't think we're at a stage where we've got, outside of Excel maybe or BI, great tools to execute, a strategy of end-to-end margin. So are you monitoring it daily, weekly?
And are we creating spreadsheet jockeys to do
it
instead of
creating
creating
dashboards?
Yeah, we've got all these Excel ghettos. Let's see what questions you've got for the panel. Anyone got a question for the panel? Raise your hand. We've got one up here with Bobby and one up here with Karen, if we can get the mics to the two folks. It's analytics. I had a person the other day tell me that our systems are like Hotel California. The data checks in and it doesn't check out. People can't use it, right? So
I do it with that example. Yeah. There's other parts of that song.
Yeah. Bobby, what question do you have for the panel?
Yeah, Bobby Miller from Ortec. When it comes to the retail, my question to you all is, are you being fair to the retail since they're actually moving from brick to mortar to becoming more omni-channel? is it fair to say that they have a lot of homework to do and they're investing a lot of money to change the way they do business? Is it, is that a challenge in itself for them?
Well, totally, omni-channel and what's happening here. But, they've also been laggards on the adoption of technology and, things that are basic like perpetual inventory and the evolution of analytics. And I was really fighting for retail. I kept going back and forth in the data when I was writing the report, but they are so lopsided of either operating margin or inventory turns. I mean, look at these numbers, Bobby. What this is really embracing is bringing this up as a portfolio, and I don't think we've got it at the retail level. Anybody else got any thoughts here at retail?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a question of being unfair. I think it's just they're at a immature stage of the mental model of what a supply chain is all about. And I think that what they've done traditionally is they've pushed a lot of their costs backwards into the suppliers. And I think that has gone away because the suppliers have taken all the inventory and buffers out. I was with a distributor wholesaler the other day, and they asked me, I said, what on earth is going on with the consumer goods manufacturers? Because we can't get the right levels of inventory, so we can't deliver on time and full. It's because the pressures on inventory, because it's working capital related on the supplier side. So I think there's shifting power forces in the retail supply chain. Just a level of immaturity, that's all.
And Roddy, I don't think it's all about value. I think, the promotions of, taking money on one hand and putting it in our pocket and not really driving value, right, is an issue. Mickey?
I was just going to say, keep an eye on what happens with some of the brands here. So if I look at CVS Caremark Corporation, now they're what, CVS Healthcare? Isn't that what their new slogan or new name is going to be? Let's see what happens to them, because there's a brand image that's going to happen here, and it may have an impact on what the supply chain is trying to do. I'm sure it will. And then Dollar General, if I recall, they're in the middle of trying to buy Family Dollar.
Right.
So what impact is that going to be? Go back to Dave's, point here around mergers and acquisitions, what's going to happen there. And look where they're rated from 1 and 2. So that's going to be a big difference as well.
Yeah, and maybe they'll make the list next year. Maybe, Bobby, you'll help them make the list next year. So, okay, Karen, you had a question here.
Yes, Karen Conway with GHX.
Let's let the mic get to you. There you go.
Karen Conway with GHX. A question probably primarily for Roddy, but like your perspectives, Lora or others.
Right.
In terms of healthcare, I know that you did rank the hospital industry or healthcare system industry, but it's difficult because while it's changing, the majority are still not-for-profit, and so you don't have some of the reports that you could use for that. But I think about your comment, Lora, earlier about bigger organizations having a harder time doing improvement. Roddy, your statement related to, yes, there hasn't been an incentive to change, but we also see significant mergers and acquisitions, both on the medical device and pharmaceutical side, as well as on the hospital and healthcare system side. So your thoughts in terms of what really can happen, will happen, particularly with the pressures of healthcare reform.
Okay,
Sure.
Roddy.
Yeah, this is a great topic. If you've seen Jim Cafone, who's the head of supply chain logistics at Pfizer, if you've seen his presentation and the write-ups about him in the New York Times, where he's defined the strategy for Pfizer as building this cloud-based control tower. In fact, he was the one that stood up in a conference that said, if you only talk to yourself in ERP systems, fine, right? That's the challenge. So it's all of this segmented data, which is aggravated by the regulatory and privacy concerns of the data. But if we can get it right to get past all these silos of systems and build process capabilities in the cloud and start running these businesses as cloud-based end-to-end systems, I think that there's a good chance that healthcare could leapfrog literally to the front. And you're already seeing that, sorry, Lora, with the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation and the way they're distributing drugs in Africa. They're making incredible progress simply because they're taking very novel approaches to sharing information and getting visibility.
All right, I'm going to disagree with you here. I think they lack leadership, right? This end-to-end, the kind of leadership we saw with Dave. I think we're still very functional there.
Sure.
And Karen, I think what we've done is we've automated transactions, and we haven't really built the supply chain core competency that we see in high tech, and particularly in medical device. If we look at that and we look at those low turns and the lack of progress, right? My challenge is really how do we get on with it? And I think we've had a lack of leadership. I think about consumer packaged goods and retail and adoption of GS1 standards and building VMI and Retail Link. I don't see anyone in pharma or medical device that's really stepping up to the plate to really drive those kind of collaborative efforts in that same way.
Well, you're starting to see it. I mean, I'm doing a workshop with AstraZeneca in a couple of weeks' time, and they're really starting to go to the next phase of that. I do think, though, that you're right about transactions. You know, the regulatory controls and the systems of record has forced them to be very transactional in the way they run their businesses. And I think it's getting beyond that, which is why, you know, not getting rid of that transactional layer in the systems of record, but putting a process layer that overarches the end-to-end healthcare system, I think, is what's going to do the trick. But we're a way away from that.
And I think it requires awareness. So what other questions do we have? We have a question over here. Thank you.
Is it on now? Yes. Thomas Case again, Spam Matters. Mostly for Roddy, perhaps. You touched a bit on this. I was thinking of firms where you have a large portion of supply chain outsourced, right? Let's say I'm extreme example, right? I'd be the brilliant tech firm out of Silicon Valley. I get funded at Sand Hill. I go to Flextronic, someone like that, and you build it all for me, and I've got some distribution, another partner, right? I don't really have any supply chain of my own, really, right? It's all pushed out. That would be an extreme end, right? But generally, like automotive, but also retail, I think, you have so much shifted out to this multi-tier network of suppliers. So any metrics you derive is an artificial construct, really, that's just based on financial numbers, but where probably 60, 70% of what goes on behind those numbers are actually your supply base.
Let's take this on.
Right.
I think an outsourced supply base is your supply chain, right?
But still, right, when you're analyzing the quality of Apple, and it's really, let's say, Japan Glass and their efficiencies.
So what do you think, CJ?
Yeah,
Should Apple own its supply chain?
They would say they do, yeah. I would say it forces the dynamic of somebody who maybe was a planner or a purchaser or logistics. They don't have those functions, but it doesn't mean that they don't look at those functions. So Apple has their fingers into all parts of their first, second, third tier supply network, and it's not for what you'd see as traditional supply chain functions. They're looking at end-to-end, and Roddy talked about this, end-to-end visibility. But what they're watching is saying, we have to maintain these margins, these inventory turns, this revenue target, and I need to see when my fifth tier has a glitch. When a control limit breaks, how is that going to impact me? What kind of scenarios am I running? You know, at Cisco's here, they'll say this, a lot of it's outsourced, but they focus a ton on risk management in their network. What could happen? Seagate's another one. Seagate had put a ton of money into their supply network after the Thailand floods, made them wake up and realize, I need to go be much more collaborative, much more in tune with what's going on, because they now have a ton of our cash so that they can make it through the post-flood. So it's a different perspective of supply chain. You become this end-to-end collaborator rather than somebody who is just the logistics person in that function.
Well, let me ask Mickey, because I think the essence of this question is at the friction of sourcing and supply chain, right?
Yep.
And I often see people will source and procurement will become really strong, and there'll be this tension between procurement, project-based, right? Yep. And we create strong procurement and we kill the supply chain and the outsourcing, and then we have to learn that procurement is part of the supply chain.
Right.
Thoughts there?
I would say it goes back to what I said in the beginning here. If you look at, I don't know if you've got the ranking there, but if you look at it, most of the high-tech companies are at the top of that, okay? And that is a supply chain. And they've got to move those dials back and forth, to CJ's point. That's the way they look at it, the way they do it, the way they're looking at all those tiers. It's the whole supply chain. I think there's a lesson learned out of that. The other companies may not be looking at it that way. They may have pieces outsourced, but they're not looking at it as a full network that they have control of, that they can work with, and they can get to that next level. I think that's a really good point and a really good lesson. Yeah. Thank you for bringing it up.
I do too.
If I can add something to that, I mean, make no mistake, there's a lot of outsourcing and contract manufacturing in the life sciences industry. I mean, you may not see it, but some of them have hundreds of contract manufacturers. Now, here's the interesting point. There is a massive movement underway to bring them into the product supply network and make them part of planning. Traditionally, they've been owned by the procurement organization, and supply chain doesn't even have anything to do with them. And you interview those contract manufacturers, they'll say, well, we get 5 scheduled changes a day, and then there's a fight over who's going to pay for the overage. So I think there's a fundamental change underway that looks at the product supply network, whether it's external or internal, starting to operate as a network.
Well, in closing, these are my insights, right? As takes leadership, talent, the movement from inside out to outside in, the horizontal focus, the active and intentional design, and planning matters. Roddy, what speaks to you?
Leadership.
Leadership.
Those organizations that have made the break and are making progress, it's because there's a clear leadership vision. They know where they're going and they know where they're stuck.
Nikki, what speaks to you?
Horizontal process. You can't just be siloed. You've got to be able to look across the entire business and understand what you need to get done from a workflow basis.
CJ?
Yeah, I'd concur with leadership. I mean, look at it, and I'd say end-to-end view. So when your network is end-to-end, your leaders have to get the right talent, have to get the right metrics in place. And you see each one of those folks, EMC, Seagate, Cisco, they all have an end-to-end leadership story.
So here's what I think doesn't work, project-based focus, vertical excellence, right? I think, Nikki, we've taken the supply chain backwards through a lot of strong procurement, unchecked complexity, big bang projects, pushing cost and waste backwards. Would you agree, or anything you'd add there, Roddy?
I think the first two are the fundamental. It's a mental model in organizations that it's projects focused on vertical excellence, and too much of a good thing gets them stuck.
How about you, Mickey?
I love the last point about pushing cost and waste backwards in the value network. If you listen to what CJ just said about how the high-tech industry focuses, and many of those that are sitting at the top of that list, you can see that while they may be working with many tiers, they're not necessarily shoving it down.
Right. CJ?
Yeah. I'd say unchecked complexity, and the one I'll call out in the rankings is Logitech. They're here. Mm-hmm. They were a product that looked at PC industry alignment, and that was a tough industry because it got hammered with the iPads and such like that. But they maintain leadership in consistency in their metrics. They may be in the 20s or something, but they really looked at good complexity, bad complexity, and managed it well. So.
All right, we're going to go now to lunch. Thank you very much. Let's celebrate the success of the winners, and let's have a good time at lunch. Thank you very much.
Well done.